today is Earth Day, which is a day that we all reflect on different ways that we can make our planet a little cleaner and a little greener. Today we're going to read a story about a friend who found a way to do that himself. It's Curious George, and he discovers recycling. George was a good little monkey and always very curious. He was especially curious about protecting our environment and keeping the planet clean. Do you want to learn about recycling with George? George had been getting ready to throw away a big bag of trash. As he was about to lift the heavy load into the garbage chute, he heard the doorman shout, "Wait! Are you sure that trash is all trash?" George didn't know what the doorman could be talking about. The bag was filled with things that George and his friend, the man with the yellow hat, no longer needed and were ready to throw away. "We need to separate recyclables from trash," the doorman told George, taking the bag. He grabbed a few items and tossed some in a big blue bin labeled with arrows. "Recycling makes our planet a lot neater, George. And on top of that," he said, handing him a flyer, "there's a contest for the city's apartment buildings. The building that collects the most recycling wins." That all sounded great to George, except he didn't know what recycling was. George wanted to help recycle once he figured out how to do it. George showed the flyer to the man. Recycling makes old bottles and cans into new bottles and cans. Otherwise, trash would just pile up all over the planet, said the man with the yellow hat. This made George very worried. He didn't like thinking about Earth covered in trash. The man with the yellow hat could tell George was concerned. He had an idea. "Say, George, would you like to visit the recycling center? Then you can see how this whole thing works." Just a few minutes ago, George didn't even know what recycling was. Now he was going to see it in action. On their way out, they saw the doorman bringing the recyclables to the outside bins for the contest. "We're off to an impressive start," said the doorman. George and his friend arrived at the recycling center. George saw 4 big pictures hanging above 4 big containers. There was a cardboard box, a glass box, a tin box, and a plastic jug. Being a curious monkey, George jumped right into the bin full of glass bottles and jars. Just then, a man who worked at the recycling center came over. "My monkey would like to see what recycling is about," said the man with the yellow hat. The worker took a glass jar from George's hand, turned it over, and pointed to the bottom. There was something George had never noticed before: 3 arrows shaped like a triangle. "When you see these 3 arrows like this, it means the item can be recycled," the worker said. "Come with me. Once the item gets to the recycling center, the next step is for it to be sorted properly and then cleaned," the worker explained. George saw lots of jars, bottles, and containers cruising down a conveyor belt. They were going to end up in those big bins he'd seen. The worker then showed George a poster. It explained the recycling process. Recycled glass is broken into smaller bits and then melted down. Plastic too, he said. Even recycled paper could be broken down to make new paper. George could hardly believe this was all possible. There was so much to recycle. Back at the apartment, the competition was heating up, and the doorman was worried they were falling behind. Thanks to his visit at the recycling center, George had some good ideas about what he could help recycle. He went upstairs to get started. In the refrigerator, George saw lots of containers he could turn in for the recycling contest, but none of them was empty. An olive jar only had a few olives left in it, and the ketchup container was only half full. What if George just combined them? When George finished going through the refrigerator, he moved on to the rest of the apartment building. He saw big plastic paint buckets with arrows on the bottom. He took them. He saw a grocery delivery just sitting outside an apartment door. He took the shampoo and the juice bottles. A stack of pizza coupons? That paper could be recycled. He took the whole pile. All of these things could help fill the building's recycling bins. George was so happy to be helping and recycling. While George was collecting these items, the doorman was talking to the doorwoman next door. Her building was competing in the recycling contest as well. The more people recycle, the better it is for our earth, she said. And if your building participates in some reuse programs, you'll help the planet even more. The doorman didn't know the difference between reusing and recycling. The doorwoman explained that reusing simply means using something again. In her building, people leave their magazines in a common area for people to read. Instead of throwing away moving boxes, they keep them in the basement for other people to use when they need them. Hey, I reuse my shopping bags, said the doorman. He was already doing it. When the doorman returned to his recycling bins, they were filled to the top. The doorwoman was impressed, but the doorman wasn't sure where all this stuff had come from until... Someone took my paint pails! My groceries were stolen! Where are the pizza coupons? All their items were in the recycling bins. The doorman was confused, but just then George came outside carrying another stack of newspapers. The man in the yellow hat was right behind him. I think I know where the extra recycling came from, the man said, holding his olive jar, which was full of ketchup. George, you recycle things after you use them. Oops, George had forgotten that part. After George and the doorman returned all the extra items, it turned out to be a tie with the doorwoman's building. The two buildings could share the trophy. George eyed the 3 big arrows on the front of the trophy. That's not recycling, George, they all laughed. George would get the hang of recycling soon enough. The end.